Hi everybody, I'm Ginny Lobel with Defined Health, and we welcome you to today's Defined Health Insight Series webinar, Pricing and Paying for Progress, Disrupting the BioPharma Business Model. Today's discussion will be led by Ed Saltzman, President and Founder of Defined Health. We're pleased to take time out from our busy strategic business development consulting activities to bring you our Insight Series webinars as a way of showcasing how we think about and view various critically relevant topics for the biopharmaceutical ecosystem moving forward. Before we begin today's session, I want to note that early registration is open for our upcoming Cancer Progress 2017 conference in New York in March 2017. There we will feature sessions on the microbiome, aging and cancer, exceptional responders, and valuing innovation in oncology, to name just a few topics. Please visit cancerprogressbydh.com for more information on this exceptional two-day event. We're sending invitations now to meet with our clients and colleagues during JP Morgan and at Biotech Showcase in San Francisco in January, where Jeff Bachman will be leading a panel somewhat voluminously entitled The Overflowing I.O. Buffet, Next-Gen I.O. Antibodies, Oncolytic Viruses, Bispecifics, Adoptive Cell Therapies, and Oral Immunometabolism Immunoepigenic Agents. We hope to see you in San Francisco. Next week, my colleague Danielle Mara will lead a webinar entitled Antibiotics, the Next Big Thing Again, featuring a discussion with KOL Dan Shapiro and VCs Dennis Purcell and Doug Goldstein from Aislinn Capital, who are invested in the space. To learn more about Defined Health, our capabilities, and our upcoming conferences, give us a call, send an email, or visit our website at definedhealth.com, and we'll be happy to tell you more. We hope to have time for questions at the end of the presentation. Please send your questions along as you think of them, and if we don't get to them in this hour,
activity across the board, and we have decreased the number of phase 3 terminations rather impressively over the past several years. So I would argue that although it's incremental, R&D risk has declined in the midst of this scientific transformation. On a high level, you couldn't ask for a better outcome. And yet, investors are yawning at potential new breakthroughs. The IPO market virtually vanished in the first 6 months of 2016. It hasn't recovered in the past 6 months. So you can see the data there. It really is remarkable. And what did it take to create excitement? So despite all the scientific excitement, the scientific transformation, the dramatic stories of cures, what did excite investors? The election of Donald Trump. So what we call this Trump bump, I'm calling it a Trump bump, is rather impressive if you look at the trend just since the election. But if you look at the trend over a year, we're still underwater. We're still underwater both from the drug index as well as the biotech index. Okay, so the overall trend is negative despite this news. And I also believe that what we'll refer to as this Trump bump is likely to be short-lived. And I think that's because while it's been perceived that the election of Trump with a Republican Congress is a net boon to biotech and pharma, I believe that bashing pharma is a political no-brainer. Here you see the list of 19 industries over a course of a 10-year period between 2003 and 2013, regarded as generally honest and trustworthy. The red line is the pharmaceutical industry. The interesting take-home in this historical analysis to me, however, is that if you look at the blue line, which are banks, which basically had a fairly significant role, I think we would all agree, in taking down the global economy in 2008, they were still many, many points higher than pharma in reputation. It doesn't get better when you update the data. This is some recent Gallup data, so I couldn't give you a trend line. But I think what the title of this slide sort of says it all. How can a good burger be more popular than a life-saving medicine? Well, according to this Gallup poll, it is. So we have come a really long way from the days back in the very early 90s when a company called Merck was rated as the most admired corporation in the United States. How did we get there? And by the way, I thought before I move on, it tickled me a little bit that the pharmaceutical industry did not get last place. The federal government does. So how did we get here? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a couple of visual concepts, and if you relate to them throughout the presentation, that's good. If you get tired of them, I apologize. But let me just introduce my first character actor here. This is your stereotypical pharmaceutical executive in 1991, which just happens to be 25 years ago. So what I wanted to do was put our executive from 1991 in a time machine, fast forward by 25 years, and see where we come out. And actually, when our executive from 1991 steps out of the time machine, a lot of things that he recognizes as the things that made this industry successful from the standpoint of its business model are still very much in force. They're listed here. They include a focus on promoting overwhelmingly to physicians, a major use of direct-to-consumer advertising, the predominance of the Me Too model, selling drugs on a unit basis as opposed to perhaps on outcomes, the fact that it's an off-the-shelf industry, and the fact that the industry loves the model of therapeutic chronicity, a drug that you take every day, hopefully for the rest of your life. So let me just take you on a little quick run through the data here, just to illustrate these points. We are definitely reducing as an industry our investment in detailing. The most recent data I could pull up was in 2014, so we do see a declining trend, although it seems to have leveled off. That is really interesting, but if you look at the overall mix, of various ways to influence physician behavior, detailing still remains close to 2/3 of the effort in 2014. It may have come down a little bit from there, but the point is that, almost any emphasis on detailing today may be misplaced. We'll get into that in a little bit. At one time, direct-to-consumer advertising that the prototypical pharmaceutical executive may have come up with in 1991. In fact, 1991 does date to the beginning of this trend, which was a blip on radar compared to where it is today, but still, although larger, quite recognizable from the direct-to-consumer advertising that began in 1991. We still have unit-based pricing. You read about value-based pricing agreements, but in the main, drugs are sold by the pill, by the vial, and are sold and priced that way and commercialized that way. Pharma is still an off-the-shelf business. We sell a lot more vials these days than we used to, but pharma still remains a business in which, all the cost is traditionally, the risk is up to approval. And what you do is that you manufacture a gazillion copies of the drug and sell it all over the world. It's an off-the-shelf business. Therapeutic chronicity still remains the standard of care, this idea that we would like, ideally, a patient, as I said earlier, to take a drug once a day for the rest of their life. The Me Too model, that you at one point would have been shot for coming up with an original idea for a first-in-class drug, because it wouldn't be a good idea because someone would already be doing it, and the path to success was following late to market with an undifferentiated knockoff. That is still a recognizable feature of the industry, and I will be going in detail on that in a minute. And here we are. This is a group of products called the anti-CGRPs, very promising new therapies for chronic migraine sufferers. But if you look at the phase 3 pipeline, you look at 4 companies poised to launch within a very short period of time of one another. And you look at even back in the pipeline, and you look at the concentration of companies just at the starting gate. So is this a problem? I'm going to leave that hanging for you for a minute, and then I'll answer it. But I'm also going to tell you that it's not just the CGRPs. It's the JAK inhibitors for inflammatory disease, one on the market, many, many on the way. So I am going to tell you that if we look at the off-the-shelf model, if we look at therapeutic chronicity, if we look at all the things I've just talked about, particularly the Me Too model, I'm going to surmise to you that over 25 years, pharma's dress code may have seen more change than the business model. And that is something that I think we have to begin to wrestle with as an industry urgently. And I think in wrestling with them, we might want to isolate the things that our time traveler still recognizes, but which are actually destroying value today. And let me just take you quickly through those. So I mentioned detailing, just to show you. I think we all get this, but it always impresses me, at least, when I actually get to see it, okay? Here is a statement that, that the percentage of independent physicians, and this was made in 2013, so we're 3 years more into this trend, all right? The percent of independent physicians decreased from 60% in 2000 to 30% in 2013, okay? I don't want to hazard a guess what it is today, but I would be greatly surprised if it's more than 15 or 20%. Negatively impacted the ROI of traditional detailing. We need to change legacy commercial models, roles, and incentives, of course. And complicating matters further is that those physicians who are not independent practitioners anymore and are responsible and do need to report to higher authorities are now being restricted. All right, and just 3 years ago, which would have taken us back from this paper back to 2012, a third of physicians put tight restrictions on pharma access. In 2015 and to 2015, it was 53%. We could guess what it is now. I'm sure it's well over 60%. How about that DTC? How's that working out? Well, one, it's louder and more expensive than ever, so that trend really developed. One would think it was working, but first of all, it's never been popular, except as a source of terrific material for Saturday Night Live. So it is, pushed the AMA fairly recently into saying, let's get rid of it. It's useless and it's driving up costs. But even if you were willing to ignore the AMA, I don't think you could ignore the data, all right? So the data basically said that the trend line is back to 2006, okay, when we had less spend. About 2% to 7% of patients who requested a drug after seeing a DTC ad actually got a script, okay? Those were dollars, revenues that could be recognized. Fast forward a few more years to 2010, it's gone up, it's 19%. But if you plot the lines of the spend, of the increased spend, the antagonism and the PR hit that it's causing to the industry, one would really start to question as to whether it was wise to continue this investment. What about the Me Too's? Well, first let me sort of level set as to how we got into this. We got into this because if you remember time, sort of midway along the path of our time traveler, so let me take you back to 2003, when all the investment in novel targets identified through the sequencing of the genome were in the process of turning, or they were all going bad. Right? And so McKinsey came along and told pharma senior management that that was okay because incremental innovation always worked in the past. And they have said that it wasn't first-in-class drugs against completely new targets, but follow-on drugs that improved the efficacy or reduced the side effects of existing compounds. McKinsey's a pretty influential organization in the C-suite, and I would surmise to you that has a lot to do with how we got into this particular predicament we're in today. And we are in the predicament that Me Too model is still very much alive. Our time traveler recognizes it very well, but it is far from a good thing. It is far from a good thing that we have 85 anti-CD20 agents reported in development from preclinical through pre-registration. You can see the numbers here. And scratch your heads, as I do, and try to figure out how we are going to find markets for all of these agents and how we're going to even differentiate, maybe a quarter of them. And the problem is, without clear differentiation, we are flirting with disaster with the persistence of the Me Too model. Because in the era of dramatic and rapid customer consolidation, this is an enormous problem. Fewer and larger customers are pushing pharma around like never before. If you look at and this is one of these slides I like to call a fun with numbers exercise, so it requires some poetic license. But I was curious to look at the consolidation amongst the top Medicare Advantage plans versus the consolidation in pharma, understanding that consolidation of your customers is never necessarily a really good thing, consolidating the power in the hands of a few. And indeed, it is well over 2x the rate of consolidation has occurred on the payer side. The payers are also bulking up not only in size, but in the power of their weapons. And of all the weapons in the hands of the payers, the most significant and nasty one and the most impactful one, and one you will be reading about more and more and more over the next several years, is this thing called the exclusion list, which is exactly what it says it is. You are going to be excluded from our formulary. That's not Tier 3. That's not prior authorization. That's not step edit. That is, you are not on our formulary, and if a patient comes with a prescription for the product, they will pay the full retail price. Now, what exclusion lists do is they fully disrupt that wisdom that McKinsey put out in 2003, okay? They fully disrupt longstanding wisdom about first or best in class. Novo knows this painfully well, as they tried to take on Express Scripts and lost badly when Victoza wound up on the preferred GLP-1 of many physicians and patients, and by far the leader in market share, wound up on the exclusion list. The rest was history. It's continuing. It's absolutely continuing. The fact that these exclusion lists actually targeted injectable products was very interesting, not only to me but to a lot of people, because injectable products have more personal impact, one would argue, than swallowing a pill. And yet the exclusion lists were done with not a lot of outcry from patients advocacy groups, and created major damage to the pharma companies that played the game of chicken the wrong way. This has now resulted in an industry that doesn't want to be on the exclusion list. And the cost of not being on the exclusion list is a dramatic increase in what we call the gross to net discount. The gross to net discount for one particular pharmaceutical company, Pfizer, is taken right out of their 10K. So you can see a rather disturbing trend of the net sales declining. At the same time, the givebacks are increasing. This trend, we see nothing here, okay, to disrupt this trend going forward, at least over the next several years. So I've covered the factors that we probably need to take immediate action to change. What about those factors that our time traveler would still recognize, but which one would argue are not necessarily value destructive today, but that perhaps we ought to be giving a lot of thought about how to re-engineer them, tweak them, remodel them, whatever you want to call it, to keep them relevant. And that's what today's pharmaceutical executives are tasked with. We're going to have to look forward. We're going to have to figure out what to do with these, because there are going to be trends, and I'm going to go through a few trends in terms of the progress, particularly in biology, that are going to force us here. We're going to need a lot of forward thinking. So let's start with the things we need to rethink, okay? One of the things we need to rethink is this long-standing AWP model, which for those of you who actually are sitting out there saying, oh, that's average wholesale price, I'd like to actually tell you that now it stands for ain't what's paid. And for those of you who suffer from motion sickness, I apologize as this scrolls down your screen. This is the only way to possibly present such a tortured position that we currently find ourselves in as a pharmaceutical industry, with the proliferation of middlemen, with conflicting and various incentives that they all have a piece of the action of pricing. We know this is not sustainable. This cannot go on. And it is part of the reason that Pfizer is facing, not only Pfizer, but all of pharma is facing the gross to net discount crisis that I highlighted a minute ago. Okay? So how do we get out of it? How do we adapt? Because I said these are not necessarily things that we have to throw out the door, but we better adapt them. And at least in some of these areas, we better move from selling units in the crazy quilt of pricing, pricing incentives that we have now, and we better move to selling commercializing outcomes. I know you're sitting out there saying easier said than done. I fully agree, but that is not an excuse not to do it, as the pressures from the other side and on the old model of selling units continue to amplify. The problem, of course, crystallized here, all right, is that volume was always an issue for pharma. Volume times price was where you got your sales. Value was never really a priority for pharma. So we are rapidly playing catch-up. And we're playing it against the landscape that's changing. So I call this the effort to objectively establish value, not going pharma's way. I put objectively in quotes here because I think it's fair to say that at least BMS and Amgen didn't feel that ICER, okay, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, to which they contributed funding for, did a very good job of objectively establishing the value of their drug. But that's the point. Pharma came late to the game, okay? They are up against valuation experts at this point, okay? And this is a very, very tough battle to fight as pharma continues to hopefully increase its level of sophistication in establishing the value of its medicines. But the issue is when you try to do that after the drug is launched or too late in the product development cycle, it's impossible. The process of establishing value has to begin early in development, and increasingly it has to begin earlier and earlier and earlier. Importantly, this idea about the off-the-shelf model, okay, it's not fully supportive of what's going on in terms of the next generation of emerging breakthroughs. Are we going to continue to be able to sell drugs off the shelf and make drugs off the shelf? Of course. Will that continue to be the most desired business model? Of course. But I have to point to your attention that just 6 or 7 companies that I would call individualized therapy players, these are mainly the CAR T companies. The other day, some of their market caps, it comes to $12.5 billion worth of investor confidence in companies without any revenues, all of which lose significant amounts of money, and few or none of which have any near-term hope of an off-the-shelf product. So as the investor excitement is building on that end of it, pharma is still stuck in its preference for an off-the-shelf model. This is a problem because just like pharma coming late to the game and establishing value, pharma is completely late to the game and in fact mostly out of building those capabilities that would connote preferred partner status on them in this rapidly changing scientific environment. These are things like sophistication in dealing with evolving payment and reimbursement models for autologous therapies, knowledge of regen medicine and other technologies, experience in patient involvement models, you name it. Capital by itself, which sits at the center of this, is helpful, but it is not going to do the job all by itself. And pharma is not doing the job. If you look at the partnering landscape for these individualized therapy companies currently worth $12.5 billion, you see Bayer on there, you see Novartis, which was an early adopter and maybe a retreater, more on that in a minute, but you see in the light colors, you see a landscape thoroughly dominated by the large biotech companies. And to my point, Novartis, which was, to its credit, was a very early adopter in almost just lightning speed, the 4 years passed from the way this field started with a $20 million investment in UPenn to the field that became $12.5 billion today. Had a setback when Novartis said, you know what, we're dropping gene therapy as a separate unit, okay, from our cell and gene therapies. It's part of our internal organization design. All right. There was a lot of pushing back from this and defense from this. This did not play well on a PR point of view. And certainly the CEO of one of those companies contributing to that $12.5 billion, the CEO of Kite, after basically saying I have great respect for Novartis, then said, based on my experience, I can't imagine how you manage an operation like CAR T in the midst of a major pharma R&D division completely absorbed with producing off-the-shelf products, okay? I added that. He didn't see that part, but I think that was clear. And it goes in the next statement, all right? It's not about developing a treatment in a vial or pill. It's a 24/7 process involving many, many people. So the question is, can Novartis be successful in that? I don't know. The Kite CEO said I don't know. But I think the jury will be out. I wouldn't be betting that this is exactly the way that will be proven to be the best way to move this forward. Okay. What about the chronic therapy model? Okay. Same deal here. All right. This is a great model. We will continue to sell chronic therapies for the industry's sake, hopefully for a really, really long period of time. But we've got to evolve the model. Why do we have to evolve the model? Because we're getting on the verge of having curative products. Not just those potentially curative immuno-oncology programs I cited at the beginning of this talk, but therapies that are gene therapies, single-use therapies that take care of disease, hopefully, for a really long time, if not the rest of the patient's lives. How do we price these things? Well, we've had this debate for quite a few years. We could do a classic upfront one-time payment, an annuity model, pay-for-performance risk-sharing model, which, by the way, isn't going really well for traditional pharmaceutical products. So what do? Because we have to do it soon. Otherwise, the excitement of this therapeutic transformation, which was felt with the approval just over a year ago of the first approved gene therapy, Unicure's Glybera, launched in Germany, and if you look at the investor excitement that drove, turned out to be a bust. Okay? Now, there are a lot of reasons it was a bust, all right? And to be fair, there were a lot of questions around effectiveness. But I'm going to stick on the commercial argument and say the thought process that led to let's charge $1 million for this, I believe was done, okay, on the back of a napkin, all right? None of those thoughts of annuity model, pay for performance, value-based pricing had played a big role in that nice round $1 million figure, all right? And to the credit of the CEO, the former CEO of Unicure, he said, I think we learned a tremendous amount what to do and what not to do, but commercially it hasn't been successful. It drains a lot from the company. Many of you know the story. The CEO left. And what we've learned from it is that pricing gene therapies can prove to be a difficult subject. These treatments have the potential to cure a disease for life, and maybe in only one dose. Awesome news for patients. For a pharma company, it means it won't have a stable income. The rush to fix this is now. I was actually surprised in putting through this request to our analyst team to see that there are not far from 250 gene therapies. I'm aware of about half of the phase 3 programs, but I hadn't been aware of close to 250 gene therapies listed in the databases that are either at or near phase 2 clinical proof of concept. So I say there's not much time to develop a better commercial game plan. I don't think it'll be a really great idea to leave this up to payers. But if you look at the press, where Allergan has done this deal with Retrosense for a drug for retinitis pigmentosa, or a gene therapy, I should say, it'll obviously be quite expensive. It says here that payers may need to develop new reimbursement models. Well, they may. But why would the pharmaceutical industry, why would companies hoping to be commercially successful in this area want to leave that up to the payers? I give you a moment to ponder that. Only a moment. So as I look to some of the things that are going on today, and you notice that for the first time our time traveler has disappeared, okay? Because there are things going on in this industry today that our time traveler would never have recognized. I list them here for you, okay? Many of these are wonderful things. So by contrast to the things destroying value, to the contrast to the things we have to adapt, these things, as we look at these drivers of our business model, these are potentially wonderful things and have been wonderful things, arguably over the last decade, but they are still starting to cause some serious problems, and we need some serious attention about how to address them. I list them for you here. You saw them over there, but I'm going, and there are more than these, but I'm going to highlight a few just in the interest of time. Before I get there, I want to introduce the overarching issue, that the biopharmaceutical business model has indeed evolved, and I'm going to show you how it has evolved. But it has not evolved sufficiently to keep pace with the advances in biology. As the challenges of biology begin to recede, it drives challenges, increased challenges, to an old, fundamentally old, somewhat refreshed, but a business model that still is in major need of reinvention. And because we haven't done that, we're standing right here, okay? I'm not going to announce what this cartoon says. You can all see it, and many of you already feel it. So let me just take you through a couple of points just to show you what I mean. I think you all know that pharma, at once completely derisive and skeptical about rare and orphan diseases, is now obsessed with drugs for smaller and smaller patient populations. Our time traveler from 1991 would be stunned by this. He would be stunned by the fact that drugs that in the main are sold for patient populations of under 100,000 patients now constitute 15% of industry revenues, forecasted to go to 22%. And these do not include drugs, oncology drugs registered as orphan drugs. These are the classic rare disease drugs. Pretty impressive. What's gone on that our time traveler would not have predicted is that over the past 2 decades, a combination of scientific progress and increased commercial hurdles have moved the industry away from what I refer to as its long-standing breadbasket, which were large PCP-managed diseases afflicting very large heterogeneous patient populations. We've moved to much smaller populations, much more homogeneous patient populations, and in the main specialty treated diseases. The degree of this shift is not always obvious to people when you're standing in the midst of it. But if you just look back 6 years and you look at the annual cost of therapy for the top 10 selling drugs in the U.S., just go back those number of years, okay, you will see one 6-digit drug, which was Avastin, which was the drug I started with as the example many slides ago, and other drugs in prices that seem quaint by the prices of the top 10 selling drugs today, where 6 figures is not unusual, 5 figures predominates, okay, but we are moving to a world in which 6 figures will not be unusual. But this update is one we better fix, because it's now both unsustainable and it has turned value destructive. And I think you know the soundbite, so I'm putting up there very quickly. The bottom line is that this is a serious problem. The progress that we've made in moving to the rare disease model and moving to smaller populations, more refractory populations, has been wonderful news for a lot of the patients with those previously ignored diseases, but terrible news from the industry, particularly in terms of its reputation and the sustainability of its business model. Okay, you've seen many of these headlines, so I don't mean to beat you up with them, but just to actually tell you that that is what leads us to the enormous sensitivity around the new crop of bad guys. We have always had price jackers in the industry. They typically didn't wind up on the front pages, but they have been mixed up, unfortunately mixed up with people. Okay, and I'm showing you the recent generation of bad guys. But they have been mixed up, all right, with the fact that wonderful, breakthrough, incredible drugs are also priced really, really high. It's an understandable problem, and a problem we better recognize as an industry. Here's the guy who obviously pushed that over the top. He is almost as famous as Donald Trump. And this is a picture of him testifying before Congress, which I like to say is one of the few times in life you still should put on a tie. You could see from his face that he was not going to be taking this, enormously seriously. So Mr. Shkreli has caused enormous problems, but he's far from the only one. Okay, let's move off from that. All right, and let's move on to another thing. So again, net positive, the fact that we've moved to better drugs. We've moved to drugs for smaller and ignored patient populations, all wonderful, okay? But we've tried to offset the decline in patient population size. We've tried to offset the volume decline by increased pricing. That's a problem that has to be remedied almost immediately. We've also largely displaced small molecules or are in the process of doing it with biologics. Is this a good thing? Well, it probably is. Lots of data around attrition rates, for instance, clearly show biologics with an enormous advantage over small molecules. But the problem with biologics is one of the nice things with biologics, which you used to hear until a few years ago, is it's not subject to the same patent cliff pressures that small molecules are. Those days are gone. Biosimilars are poised to grab a significant chunk, and this will be soon. Once a small specialist niche, we now recognize cancer. Jenny talked about our Cancer Progress Conference before. We have a big investment here at Defined Health and Cancer. It is our largest practice. By no means do I mean to say this is a problem, except it is. Okay? The overwhelming focus on cancer of the top pharmas is focused here. Our time traveler, if I put him on this slide, would have seen Bristol Myers Squibb out there in 1991 as the gigantic player in cancer with revenues of $1 billion, mostly selling drugs that today are considered to be old-fashioned poisons. Move it forward to today, and you see that $1 billion wouldn't even get you in the top 10. It probably wouldn't get you in the top 15 list. So there's been a huge focus, wonderful news for patients, wonderful news for humanity in general, and tremendous news for the pharmaceutical industry. So why is that a problem? It's a problem because the focus has been mirrored in biotech, and it's also a problem because cancer is now a high priority target for payers. The problem is that the pricing is wrong, okay? And the problem is that I call it the definition of unsustainable. This slide actually takes a moment to explain. The slide has the median monthly price of a patented cancer drug. So again, this is not average. We've taken off the outliers. This is the median price in 2016. If you actually look at that spread out over the cost of a year, if the patient was paying for that drug themselves, it's actually there you can see the share of the gross national income per capita. Okay, so any individual, all right, your average Joe having to pay for a cancer drug in the U.S. would have to tap into 189% of his income, okay, his or her income. If you look by contrast to the UK, you might start to see why, at least from the payer point of view, they see absolutely nothing wrong with an organization like NICE. I simply leave you with the fact that this is the definition of unsustainable. The fact is that payers see cancer as the next fruit ripe for picking as well, all right? So, you know, and when I mentioned exclusion lists before, understand that a drug called Xtandi, which is an anti-androgen for prostate cancer, is one of the first cancer drugs to wind up on an exclusion list. It wound up on CVS's exclusion list in 2017, where it's going to appear, all right, inconveniently for Pfizer, which just paid $14 billion to acquire that drug's manufacturer. So the timing couldn't be worse. As payers in all the markets target cancer drug costs, the problem is not, as I said, that we have a tremendous focus on cancer. The problem is it's taken focus on all the other diseases, on a whole range of diseases with huge unmet needs, all right, that present a better, compelling economic unmet need for better therapies, okay? So if you actually look at the list of the top 10 sources of time lost to disability, and if you're building value-based prices, as we like to do around here, time lost to disability is a very important driver of the price that you are at and the value and the price that you can claim for your medicine. You do not see cancer on this list. Okay, you do see mental and behavioral disorders, you do see musculoskeletal diseases, you do see neurological sense and organ conditions. You get my point, okay? We need to move investment to these areas. How well are we doing in that regard? Well, not so well. So here I spread out the pipeline, and I tell you that in cancer, the number of agents reported in clinical development, in the clinical development pipeline, is just short of 1,700. That's the number of agents. Look at it in some of those other areas presenting at least as, if not a more compelling economic unmet need, all right? And the bubbles, the blue bubbles, show you the patient populations. So look at the disconnect and the alignment. I would suggest as an industry, we're not doing well. So despite the fact that I think we seem like an industry focused only on cancer and sometimes as an industry focused only on immuno-oncology, we better start to take some of these areas a whole lot more seriously. One couple more slides, and we are pretty much we should have a little bit of time for Q&A. I'm going to bring back our time traveler because our time traveler would have a terrible time recognizing today's big pharma companies with their global scale, with their global regulatory capabilities, global commercial power, global manufacturing, because to our time traveler who was used to the top company, Merck & Company in 1991 was $7 billion in revenues, okay, would not recognize an industry that mainly through consolidation became humongous, became absolutely humongous, okay? Is that a problem? It is a problem because it's bumping up against another trend. So just like the Me Too model was bumping up against consolidated payers, this global scale is bumping up right up against the trend to it, which is an inevitable trend in all facets of technology, to personalization. So while pharma has begun to embrace the inevitable, here we see a list of companies, and this is relatively recent data, and the percent of the trials that these companies are sponsoring that incorporate patient selection biomarkers. The definition here, though, is that it is still not the majority of trials. At the same time, the science keeps pushing, and the science says, listen, we can push to greater degrees of biological personalization. Some of the most well-funded companies on the cancer side, from the venture side, have been the neoantigen companies, developing and pursuing individualized, personalized antigens, patient by patient tumor. The issue that I raise is how does this global scale sync with this increasing personalization? I would submit to you it doesn't, and I would also submit to you that this is something that needs to be thought of at a very high level, probably right in the boardrooms of pharma, because you're either going to be able to use that scale or you're going to not. And if science is pushing you and we're a scientific-based industry to personalization, the industry is going to need to figure out how to accommodate that. So what do we need to not change? And this is where I'm going to leave you. What we already have changed, and what is a wonderful change, and what we hope is a permanent change, is a change to the industry's longstanding R&D scale model, which again, our time traveler would have recognized as we invent it all inside. He may not have recognized a Pfizer campus that grew to 2.7 million square feet of facility space on a 160-acre site, that being only one of their global hubs, okay? But most of that is gone, and that's good news. That's good news for the industry. That's going to continue, and to leave you with some data that ponder, know where the value comes from, all right? So over the last, it was a period of a 3-year period, but it's good because we can look back a little, and we can look at where the late-stage pipeline valuations have been driven from. And if you look at the left side of this chart, you see that nearly 2/3 of it comes from innovation accessed externally. That's a trend that does not need fixing, does not need adapting. We just need to continue to do more and more of the same thing as an industry. And that is my last slide, except to remind you about both our panels at Therapeutic Insight in Barcelona at the BioEurope Spring Meeting and the Cancer Progress Conference, which Shani shared with you. So with that, we have about 5 minutes, I think, for any questions, and I want to thank you all. I hope many of you are still out there. It looks like a lot of you are. Tremendous. Thanks.
So I would just say thank you, Ed. That was great. Most of the quote-unquote questions up here actually compliments, so we thank all of you for your appreciation of Ed's presentation today. I'm looking to see if there is anything that I can see in here. Okay, not so there's I'm weeding through all the compliments. Ed, do you see more pressure on payers to cover expensive medicines if the pressure comes from patients, especially in light of Obamacare becoming unraveled?
Okay, let's take one question at a time. So first of all, I want to thank the audience. We're literally being created with questions. And since we will run out of time very momentarily, just please, I encourage you to send in those questions. You can send them over to Ginny. She'll get them to me, or send them to me. And we will respond to them quickly. The question regarding pressure on payers to increase access to expensive medicines, particularly in light of a potential repeal of Obamacare, or at least a substantial overhaul, is a great question. It's such a great question, I have to tell you, I don't know the answer to it. I do know a few things that will probably influence the outcome. There is a tremendous article that I often point to our friends at BioCentry for the brilliant analysis that they do. This is several BioCentries ago, it's probably 3 weeks ago, where there was a series of front page articles on the potential conflict between pharma and biotech investment in patient advocacy groups and their positions on this issue. I'm not going to get into the politics of that, but it is clear that pharma money and biotech money is flowing into patient advocacy groups, and that may indeed not only empower the groups, but tilt them to the point where they are willing to take on the insurance companies. So the battle on pricing, as the question correctly anticipates, has been a battle between the large payers and the pharmaceutical and biotech companies, and Bio, under Jim Greenwood, has particularly taken the lead on this, trying to message that increased patient exposure to co-pays and to cost sharing is driven entirely by the insurance companies' needs to pad their profit. The way this will turn out, though, I can't guess, because I can tell you that politically, as I presented much earlier in the deck, the reputation of insurance companies in pharma is almost tied. So it's going to be an interesting one, and I don't know how it will turn out.
So there's a few other questions that are kind of very focused toward the people who asked them, so we're going to answer them directly. I just want to mention before we wrap up that Ed is available over the coming weeks or months to deliver the presentation that he delivered today to your management teams or your BD and corporate development teams. So please reach out to me if that's something of interest to you. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.
Thank you.